Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. I'm standing in front of an equestrian statue of George III in London. Well, King George III, who was he? Why is he so well known? He was born in 1738 here in the United Kingdom, and he grew up in and around London, spending a lot of time in Kensington Palace and Windsor Castle. Not very much in London itself, just to the west usually. So his father was Frederick, the Prince of Wales, and his mother was a German princess. Remember, at that time, Germany consisted of 360 states, independent ones, mostly hostile, often at war against each other. So his great-grandparents had moved from Hanover because his great-grandfather, King George I, was Elector of Hanover, as in ruler of that part of Germany, and then became King of the United Kingdom. Won't go into the complicated business of why. But anyway, George III grew up bilingual in English and German. And his tutor was the Earl of Bute. So Lord Bute taught him the classics. That was the mainstay of his education, urging him to be a Tory king. The two political parties in the United Kingdom at the time were the Tories and the Whigs. And Lord Bute was very much a Tory, saying, "George, be king," and encouraging him to be a patriotic and Tory king, as Bute would see it. So George III was brought up in the Church of England, of course, and averagely religious for a man of his background. So his father died when George III was a teenager. So when his grandfather died in 1760, George III inherited it. It skipped a generation because Frederick, Prince of Wales, was no more. The eldest son of the monarch usually is granted the title the Prince of Wales, as in Prince Charles is Prince of Wales these days. So George III lost little time in marrying Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a teenage German princess, and they had a happy marriage. So happy, in fact, that they had 13 children, 8 sons and 5 daughters. He was to allow his sons to marry young, but his daughters, he made them remain spinsters, in some cases into their 30s. Didn't want them to wed, didn't want to lose their comfort. So George III, he had Lord Bute as his first Prime Minister, who would sometimes berate him and reduce him to tears, even though he was 22. But things were going very, very well at the beginning. The early 1760s was the 7 Years' War, mainly against France, and the United Kingdom triumphed in that, took Canada. Then there were the travails with America, the 13 colonies rebelling in the 1770s. King George III was a bit of a reactionary. Now, he's not the tyrant of American revolutionary propaganda, and indeed he couldn't dictate to Parliament. His power was strictly limited. His real power was that of patronage. He could appoint people to the army, the navy, had complete control over promotion, demotion, dismissal. So that, the Church of England, in the Church of Scotland, in the universities, even in a few schools and hospitals, judges, things like that. So he could appoint whichever Prime Minister and cabinet he wanted, so long as they could command support in Parliament, get parliamentary business through. So he couldn't block things. Now, theoretically, he could refuse to sign a bill into law. It wouldn't become an act, but he never did that. He did say about the Indian bill, if anyone votes for this, you'll be my enemy for life, but it passed anyway. Now, it's true that he had influence. He tried to persuade Parliament to this or that, and sometimes succeeding, sometimes he didn't. He would never succeed unless he had at least a substantial number of people who were leaning his way anyway. He would not be able to thwart the will of a high majority of members of Parliament and indeed peers. So yes, it is true that he didn't want to make concessions to American sentiment, to the Continental Congress. Had there been a more reform-minded and forward-looking monarch on the throne who had encouraged Parliament to make concessions, then perhaps the American Revolution would have been avoided. You may have heard of the Olive Branch petition, where some moderates in the Continental Congress said, well, let's strike a deal. Maybe we don't need total independence. Perhaps we can settle for something less than that, so long as London grants us serious concessions in various areas. But George III wrote back saying he'd refused to even read this. It was impertinent, and this Declaration of Independence was a nullity, and saying that this monstrous rebellion must be soon quelled, and urging everyone to help his forces do so. Well, we all know how that worked out. So that's George III. But the American Revolution having succeeded, and the defeat at Yorktown and so on, he said, well, we've got to get real, and there was the Peace of Paris. So while some people, especially Tories, were quite curmudgeonly about this, were unwilling to accept the new dispensation, George III had a change of heart. All right, the United States is independent, we have to live with it, and we have to restore amicable relations. So he's effective in doing that, especially when John Adams came over here as the first American minister, as in ambassador. So George III, in 1788, he had an attack of porphyria. He may well have suffered something similar in 1765. We're not absolutely sure if he did have porphyria, some sort of mental illness. And he became hypomanic. He became such a motor mouth, he would speak for hours non-stop, sometimes over 24 hours, about this and that. And he was fixated with farming, botany, things of that nature. Spent a lot of time at Windsor Castle. He used to walk down the high street giving gold coins to the schoolboys. No wonder the school adored him, speaking to trees. So he had to be sectioned. So he was put in the care of Dr. Willis. The various other doctors did a little bit torment him. Sensory deprivation was thought to be the way forward for people who are mentally ill. Keep them in the dark, chain them up, things like that. So they're trying to draw the bad humours down from his brain by blistering his legs. Willis wasn't into that, said, no, you must do physical work. So George III was not excused from labouring on Willis's farm, despite being a regal personage. And anyway, it did secure his temporary recovery. There is one theory that was the chemicals in wigs, they always used to wear wigs for court dress in those days, that affected him and didn't affect most people. And when he was with Dr. Willis, wearing humble clothes, toiling on the farm, he was no longer wearing a wig. So after a few weeks and months, the chemicals would be out of his system and his sanity would be restored. However, he was intermittently insane for the rest of his life. His eldest son was also George IV, the Prince of Wales. But George III had a notoriously dreadful relationship with his son and heir. And because the king was incapable of discharging his regal duties, a Regency Act was passed, which empowered George IV to be Prince Regent, to act in behalf of his father, who was temporarily incapacitated, king in all but name, and he was delighted about that. He was also a terrible spendthrift, spending so much on Carlton House, and let's see, his pavilion down at Brighton, he was going there. He more or less invented the dirty weekend. So George III was known as being faithful to his wife, and fidelity was not a common virtue amongst monarchs at the time. It was a very rakish era. See your Hogarth cartoons. And George IV, his son, he took up with Maria Fitzherbert. Mrs. Fitzherbert was a twice widowed Catholic, and there was a lot of anti-Catholicism at the time. There's a rumour that he actually secretly married her, but according to the Royal Marriages Act, no member of the royal household could wed without the say-so of the monarch, and he did not grant his permission, especially to marry a Roman Catholic. So whether he's married to Mrs. Fitzherbert or not, I don't know. He certainly had no children with her. So then, sometimes George III, his mental health came back, and he was able to resume his kingly duties. The Napoleonic Wars broke out towards the end. He was deeply unpopular in this country for some of the same reasons he was in America. Some people still considered him to be German, thought he was dictatorial, he was distant, he was cold, aloof. He said he was very proud to run the most boring court in Europe, where no interruptions were allowed. Anyone who even coughed or sneezed would be banished from his presence for a fortnight. And he didn't fly the flag. He never went outside of southeastern England. He bought Buckingham House, which he gradually turned into Buckingham Palace. Anything else notable about him? Well, by the time the Napoleonic Wars came home, it was a case of always stay close to nurse for fear of meeting something worse. And people rallied to him. He was at least familiar. And they were beginning to accept he was British. They thought there was a considerable chance that France would conquer this country. So until that time, in his public appearances, he'd often been met with deathly silence, or indeed catcalls, booing and hissing. The last decade of his life, he was blind, and he'd more or less totally lost his marbles, finally dying in 1820 at the age of 81, which was a phenomenally old age at the time. So although his physical health was superb, his mental health had long since deserted him. So that is George III, a very notable figure. Apparently the Prince of Wales holds him in a high regard. George III, for all his feelings, he really did care. Farmer George, who cared about common virtues and agronomy. Behind me, that used to be the Texas Embassy. No, not a real embassy, a restaurant. I thought it was a curious irony that an American restaurant would situate itself right beside the statue of George III. I'll switch it off now.